Hello and welcome, Minnesota Farah. We are genuinely very happy to have you with us for our daily coverage of the NFL news. Please subscribe to our channel to support our initiative as we bring to you the latest updates from the world of NFL on a daily basis. Now let's dive deep into our news stories.
NFL enthusiasts from around the world, welcome to an action-packed NFL news roundup for today. I'm your host, and I'm here to bring you all the latest updates from the National Football League. 1. Arizona Cardinals. The Arizona Cardinals are making moves, folks. They've signed Roy Lopez from the practice squad, adding depth to their defensive line. But in the world of NFL, it's not just about signings, it's also about making tough decisions. They've cut Jacob Slade from the practice squad. Injuries are part of the game, and Carlos Watkins is unfortunately placed on injured reserve due to a biceps injury. Now, let's move on to our next news. 2. Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons are soaring high with a 2-0 record this season. They've elevated Tyler Vrabel and DT Timmy Horn for their upcoming game. Keep an eye on these players as they aim to make an impact on the field. Now, let's move on to our next news. 3. Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are also sitting pretty at 2-0 this season. They've made a signing by bringing in LB Jeremiah Moon from the practice squad. On the flip side, QB Josh Johnson has been cut from the roster. It's all about balance in the NFL. Now, let's move on to our next news. 4. Carolina Panthers. The Carolina Panthers are seeking redemption after a 0-2 start to their season. They've elevated QB Jake Luton and DB DiCaprio Bootle for their upcoming game. Will these changes turn the tide for them? Now, let's move on to our next news. 5. Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears are dealing with some injuries. Khalid Kareem has been placed on injured reserve due to a hip injury, and Eddie Jackson won't be suiting up against Kansas City due to a foot injury. It's a tough break for the Bears. Now, let's move on to our next news. 6. Cincinnati Bengals. In Cincinnati, there's uncertainty around QB Joe Burrow, who's questionable with a calf injury for Monday night's game against the Rams. Irv Smith Jr. is doubtful with a hamstring issue. In other news, QB AJ McCarron is making a return to the practice squad. Now, let's move on to our next news. 7. Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns are making game day elevations, and Ty Ensek is getting his shot. On a more expensive note, QB Deshaun Watson has been fined for unnecessary roughness violations and unsportsmanlike conduct during their recent game against the Steelers. Now, let's move on to our next news. 8. Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys, with a 2-0 record, are looking strong. They've brought in DBCJ Goodwin from the practice squad. Additionally, they've elevated Sean Harlow and Brock Hoffman for their next game. Now, let's move on to our next news. 9. Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos are making moves by elevating RB Dwayne Washington. Will this addition give their offense the boost they need? Now, let's move on to our next news. 10. Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions have elevated OL Dan Skipper and S. Brandon Joseph for their upcoming game. Can they secure a win in their next matchup? Now, let's move on to our next news. 11. Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers are also making game day elevations, bringing in RB Patrick Taylor and CB Corey Ballantyne. Will these players help the Packers continue their winning ways? Now, let's move on to our next news. 12. Houston Texans. Unfortunately for the Texans, LT Laramie Tunsil won't be traveling with the team due to a knee injury, and CB Derek Stingley is out for at least 4 games with a hamstring injury. On a brighter note, DeAndre Houston Carson has been signed to the active roster. Now, let's move on to our next news. 13. Indianapolis Colts. The Colts have made a signing, bringing in RB Trey Sermon to the active roster from the practice squad. However, RB Deion Jackson is being released. Tough decisions in the world of NFL roster management. Now, let's move on to our next news. 14. Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars have elevated WR Jacob Harris for their upcoming game. Will he be the X factor they need to secure a victory? Now, let's move on to our next news. 15. Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are dealing with the loss of WR Richie James, who has been placed on injured reserve. In response, they've elevated WR Montrell Washington and LB Cole Christiansen for their next game. Now, let's move on to our next news. 16. Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders have brought in RB Isaac Rochell from the practice squad. Will he be a game changer for them? Now, let's move on to our next news. 17. Los Angeles Rams. The Rams are keeping an eye on WR Puka Nacua, who is listed as questionable for Monday night's game but is expected to play. Will he make a difference in their matchup against Cincinnati? Now, let's move on to our next news. 18. Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers have made moves by signing Zach Bailey to the active roster from the practice squad. They've also elevated S. Dean Marlowe. In the world of NFL, every addition counts. Now, let's move on to our next news. 19. Miami Dolphins. The Miami Dolphins have been hit with some bad news as WR Jalen Waddle is out with a concussion for their upcoming game against the Broncos. In response, they've elevated WR Robbie Chosen and LB Cameron Good. That's a wrap for today's NFL News Roundup, folks. Stay tuned for more exciting football action, and as always, keep your helmets on and your game faces ready. Until next time, this is your NFL narrator signing off.